Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Lipton. Welcome to our very first session of the storytelling track. Very excited. We're going to start with the building blocks of how we tell stories in relation to climate change. And those building blocks are our language and our words and our framing and our metaphors. So this is the very start of a 10-session track about how we construct stories around the environment and climate change for a more positive future. And we're starting it off with eco-linguist Aaron Stibbe. And he is joining us from the UK, where he is Professor of Ecological Linguistics at the University of Gloucestershire. And he is also the creator of a massive online learning course on eco-linguistics. It's been taken by thousands of people. And again, it's about how our use of language shapes our relationship with nature. So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today in this live Q&A, about how our words and our framings and our metaphors affect our thinking and our actions toward the planet. So welcome, Aaron. We're so happy to have you join us.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. So let's start off with the basics. Can you tell us what is ecolinguistics?
Well, ecolinguistics, I would say it's more of a movement than a discipline. So the movement recognizes that in linguistics, we kind of ignore the animals, the forests, the rivers, the ocean. Most mainstream linguistics is just about language, or perhaps it's about social issues like racism and sexism. But it's really the ecological issues that are so important for our future have been erased from mainstream linguistics. And what ecolinguistics says is that actually these are important and that linguistics should be considering other species, the physical environment, and the ecosystems that life depends on.
Mm-hmm. And so part of this, and we'll delve into this in more detail later, and I mentioned it in the intro, but it's about words, but it's also about language. It's about more than words. So could you tell us a bit more about what it entails in terms of our vocabulary, our thoughts, our framing of the natural world?
Yeah, certainly. So for me, the basic building block is stories. Now, when I use the word stories, I don't mean the kind of stories you tell to children or novels or books. I mean cognitive structures in our minds that are influencing how we think, how we talk, and how we act. So there's stories which surround us in our society all the time, like economic growth is the goal of our society. And so that's a story that is told in the words of politicians, in the words of economists, in the words of everyday people. It's a story right at the heart of our civilization, but it's a story that isn't working because economic growth has been pursued in a way that has been destroying these ecosystems that life depends on. So at its heart, ecolinguistics is about stories, revealing the stories that underpin our industrial civilization, questioning them from an ecological perspective. So are these stories helping, or are they putting us on a path towards destruction? And then if we find the stories aren't working, if they're leading us on a path towards destruction, then ecolinguistics is about finding new stories to live by.
Mm-hmm. So this field really took off in the 1990s. Could you tell us about why it really burst at that time and the conversations and the growth that it has experienced since, this field of ecolinguistics?
I think that Michael Halliday is the one who can take credit for this, because he gave a speech in 1990 where he said that it's time to really apply linguistics to ecological issues. And he gave the example of growth, and he kind of looked at the language, and growth is something which sounds positive, whereas shrink is something that sounds really negative. And this is built into the grammar of the English language. So he identified various aspects of the grammar of English which are unhelpful for our species. That's the way that he expressed that. And he said that we need to do something about that and incorporate ecological issues into linguistics. So from there, it did start to take off. And at the same time, there was also eco-criticism, ecofeminism, eco-psychology, and a whole load of other ecological humanities and ecological social science subjects, all taking off in this period and really saying that mainstream humanities has erased the ecosystems that life depends on. And we need to really start thinking about these again.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting point about the word growth specifically, because it is a positive thing. And since the time we're children, we want to grow and we want to grow all of our lives. But in terms of the world we live in now, it's not always such a positive thing. And in some ways, we do need to downsize and we do need to exhibit a bit of self-control as a species. So what do you think about that word now and the role that it plays in our collective vocabulary?
Yeah, well, Michael Halliday started experimenting with alternatives. So he was talking about negative shrinkage instead of growth, or elephantiasis instead of growth, or he was talking about growth as a cancer. So he was trying to find other ways of expressing growth. But really, I don't think we need to do that. We can just stop talking about growth, and instead we could start talking about well-being. So rather than trying to change the English language in some way and make growth negative, we can just stop talking about it and find some other stories to tell. Like if you go to Bhutan, you've got gross national happiness. So happiness is the goal of society. So much easier, don't mess around with the word growth, switch to other ways of thinking, other stories about what's important for our society.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good example with Bhutan and an off-sided one. What are some other examples of words or metaphors or framings that you think are positive to use when we're talking about climate change? What are some that you use yourself?
Yes, well, there's, firstly, if you want to think about what's positive and what would work, you've got to think about what isn't working. Mm-hmm. So just to choose one example, so climate change is often framed as a problem that has a solution. And this framing is rather unhelpful, because if something is a problem and has a solution, then that means once you've solved it, it goes away. Now, we know with climate change, it is not going away. So even if tomorrow we stopped emitting carbon dioxide, it would still take thousands of years for the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to reduce enough for there to be any cooling. So there is no cooling that is going to be happening in the future. We are stuck with the dangerous level of climate change that we have now, and it's inevitably going to get worse. So in the future, whatever happens, we have to deal with the consequences of climate change. And if we frame it as a problem and, oh, we can geoengineer it, or we can have hybrid cars, or, we've got to find these solutions. If we're thinking about problems and solutions, we're not really thinking about adapting our lives and adapting our societies and cultures to deal with inevitable climate change. So an alternative framing is a predicament. So climate change is a predicament. It's a predicament that we are facing as a species. And with a predicament, there isn't a solution. So with a predicament, you have a response. So climate change is a terrible predicament that we're in, and how are we going to respond to that? And that recognizes that it's not something that is going to go away, that there isn't a solution. Mm-hmm. So that's one example.
Mm-hmm. And what about, we've seen mainstream media sources like The Guardian and the New York Times make really conscious editorial decisions about the language they use around climate change. More specifically, The Guardian newspaper has said they're going to adopt alarmist language like climate crisis and climate emergency to really sound the alarm bells for this issue, while the New York Times and some other news sources have decided to do the opposite and to just call it climate change and to support that with facts and let the facts speak for it. So what do you think about these, in some ways, conflicting approaches to the language through such widespread, pervasive international media platforms? What effect does this have on us as listeners and of readers of this media and how we're shaping our own vocabulary?
Yes, well, as listeners to media, we are always exposed to multiple stories about any particular event. And that is something normal and natural, and that has been, that's part of the way that our lives work. We're exposed to a lot of different stories, and we filter, and we have our critical faculties, and we select stories that resonate with us. So I wouldn't say there's any problem with having multiple stories. And in fact, one of the problems is that we tend to get one dominant story that gets spread massively, across the culture. So sometimes opening up different alternatives is good and is useful. And the key thing really is to think about what story is this use of language or images, what story is it telling? So one example, which is quite a good example, is the Guardian newspaper recently was thinking about how it represents heat waves. So whenever there's a heat wave, the Guardian newspaper has pictures of people on the beach having fun and children having ice cream and going into fountains. And isn't it wonderful kind of weather? And then they realize, well, actually, these heat waves are killing many, many people. So just in the UK in 2018, there were almost 900 extra deaths because of the heat wave that we had. So the newspaper suddenly said, well, maybe we shouldn't be framing a heat wave as a positive, wonderful thing. And so they changed the kind of coverage they gave. So instead of happy people celebrating and having fun, they showed pictures of the wildfires in Australia and the animals burning alive. So I think underneath your question, there was something about calling it an emergency, some, kind of these strong images of a wildfire and animals burning, and, whether this is good or bad or if it's appropriate. And I would say we need a kind of a mixture of different stories to think about. So yes, we do need some stories which I wouldn't use the word alarmist, because that tends to be used by climate deniers, but we need some pictures and we need some stories that wake us up, make us really think that this is serious and it's important. But at the same time, we need stories and images that show that the future could be really good if we make some changes to think about climate change. So images of people spending more time with their friends and family, more time out in nature, appreciating more kind of simple, healthier food, generally their lives improving by adopting measures which are also really good for climate change.
Mm-hmm. So really showing stories of the positive outcomes of when we get it right. And the
well, that's
benefits.
right. And right now with the COVID crisis, excuse me a moment. With the COVID crisis, some people are realizing, well, actually, maybe I didn't need that holiday. Maybe I didn't need to spend all that time shopping. Maybe what's important is time with my family and nature and cooking some really healthy, good food from basic ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a forced reframing of how we look at our lives and the language we use around our lives.
Well, that's right. And as we come out of the pandemic, eventually, there's a lot of voices which say we have to go back to normal. But normal, it wasn't normal before. So before the pandemic, we had levels of consumption that were destroying the planet and exponentially rising. and we were in a position where we were consuming far more as a species than we'd ever consumed in history. It wasn't normal. So as we emerge from the pandemic, this is a time when we need to have new stories to live by. Think very carefully about the kind of language that we're using. So back to growth, you're going back to consumerism, back to like material accumulation is the goal of society, back to this idea that humans are selfish. So we've seen that humans aren't fundamentally selfish. You know, in this crisis, we've seen neighbors helping each other. We need to think about some of the positive things that have emerged from this, grab onto them and not lose them as we emerge.
Absolutely. I want to touch on something that I know you touch on in your online course, and it's the way that our words and our framings and our metaphors interact with our thoughts, which I guess is something of a chicken or the egg question as well. Like, do our thoughts form our words, or do our words form our thoughts? What do you think about this?
Right, well, my way of thinking about it is that we have stories in our minds, and these stories are kind of simple structures in our minds that help us with our thinking. So a really obvious one would be, in the UK, we think sunny weather is good. It's kind of a cognitive structure because it's in the minds of individual people, and it's in the minds of people right across the culture. So people don't really think very much. So weather forecasts on the really hottest day where lots of people are dying, and they'll say, lovely weather out there. And then they'll catch themselves and they say, oh yes, but it's really too hot and it's too dry and we need some rain. So we've got these kind of simplified stories in our minds, and they influence how we talk. So when we talk, the choice of words and grammatical expressions and metaphors and framings is influenced by the stories that are in our minds. And they also impact on our behavior, so what we do. Now, the chicken and the egg thing is like, well, where did those stories in our minds come from? Well, they came from listening to the stories around us in our culture and absorbing those stories in a kind of a simplistic way as these simple structures in our mind.
Mm-hmm. So who do you think are the power holders in these stories of our minds and in our language? Is it the media? Is it our parents? Is it our school systems? I'm sure it's a combination of many things, but are there a few that really stick out to you as holding a lot of responsibility for shaping the thoughts and the language of the general public?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it's the people around you and parents firstly, but where did they get their stories from? And then we have to think really about stories that spread. So this is where the media comes in, because the media can spread their stories to very many people. So we had traditional media, which would broadcast out stories to the population. But now we've also got social media. So other kinds of stories can also reach very large numbers of people. So even something like the coronavirus deniers, it's quite interesting. The coronavirus deniers and the climate deniers, they're often the same people. And they've managed to broadcast the daftest, craziest messages out to millions of people using social media. Like coronavirus is caused by 5G, and it was just invented to draw attention from the fact that 5G is killing people. So they managed to spread these stories through social media. Mm-hmm. But also another powerful source would be, say, textbooks at schools. So the textbooks are written by a particular narrow group of people. And so they spread stories right across, large numbers of people. So yeah, I would say the dominant stories emerge when people are in a position to spread them widely. So it could be social media, people who can manage to create viral videos, the media, politicians, people who write textbooks. They have an inordinate effect on our stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Before we take a few questions from the audience, I just want to follow up on what you've touched upon throughout, starting with calling climate change a predicament, and some of the other positive words like normal or how we address growth differently that have been scattered throughout this conversation. Could you give some other specific examples of words and language that you would like to see more people adopt in relation to climate change and our interaction with the planet?
Yeah, so I could give a simple example, and this is not going to sound good at first, but climate change is an incurable illness. So that sounds like a really negative kind of framing. But at the same time, it avoids some of the problems with the problem solution framing. So it makes it something that is serious. It makes it something that is not going to go away and something that we have to respond to. So what do you do if you have an incurable illness? Well, you have to manage it as best you can. You have to try and not make it worse. You have to reinvent your life around it. And you also have to think carefully about your life and unfinished business that you really need to think about what's important in life and just focusing on the important. But one thing I'd like to say is it's not, eco-linguistics is not really about this one's bad, this one's good. What I'd really like to do is to encourage everyone to be more critical about the kind of language that they use. So what language am I using? What linguistic features and devices are there in the language that I use? What stories are they telling about the world? And do those stories align with my values? Because a lot of those stories might have just come to us from mainstream culture without us giving them much thought. So it's time to start thinking. And then finally, how can I change my language to convey the values that I want to convey? So eco-linguists, rather than this is good, this is bad, I think we want to kind of raise critical awareness of language among as many people as we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough work. Thank you for doing it. And okay, so we have a question from Gloria Payaras coming from Barcelona, Spain. She's an environmental reporter herself. And she's asking, when communicating about environmental issues, what is the issue that we most often get wrong from an eco-linguistic perspective?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Gloria, for that. I think, okay, I will go for the biggest problem of all of them, sustainability. So when we communicate about sustainability, it's often as people, planet, and profit. So the problem with this is that profit then becomes wrapped into sustainability. So people think if I'm pursuing a profit, then that's part of my sustainability actions. And then what happens is that then becomes the main part of the sustainability actions. So sustainable development often described as maximizing economic growth while protecting the resources that we need for further increases in growth. So one of the biggest framing problems, and you can see this in the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, you can see this everywhere, is that you're combining growth and wealth and everybody in the entire world getting richer, trying to combine that with protecting the environment when it's impossible. So for me, sustainability and development needs to be framed about, yes, growing the economies and the wealth and the prosperity of the people who really need it, so the people who are living in poverty. But at some point, some rich people will need to reduce their consumption. So this is the most unpopular message, and it's one that gets erased and it gets hidden. The simple message that people who are consuming too much will need to consume less.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a very politicized issue. And it's tough to stay straight on that one for sure.
It's hard because no matter how many wind turbines we have, how many electric cars we have, how much recycling we do, if there's no reduction in the people who consume most and everyone else is trying to consume the same amount as them, we don't have enough planets to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question is coming from Sekar Kanasi, who's a research assistant from Bogor Agricultural University in Indonesia. And Sekar is asking, as a listener, how can we better filter the media that affects us? So how can we get the media that's framing our thoughts in the right way more at the top and filter out the things that lead to saying
Yes,
five
well,
Ps, right?
yeah, well, my answer to that is to become an eco-linguist. So learn about eco-linguistics and some of the techniques in eco-linguistics that help to reveal these stories. So we have our free online course and it's Stories We Live By. If you just put Stories We Live By into Google, you'll find our free online course in eco-linguistics. There's lots of resources there. And there's teaching materials in eco-linguistics available in other places as well. So that's it, learn the techniques of eco-linguistics because they're really useful for revealing the hidden messages that underlie the media, what the politicians say, the IPCC, environmental groups. You can really start to see the hidden messages underneath their discourse, reveal them, and then you can start being critical of it and searching for new forms of language.
Absolutely. So educate yourself first. And then we have one last question that's coming from Kanchana Bandara, who's a lecturer in Sri Lanka. And Kanchana is asking, how do we legitimize a certain narrative that we want to see established in society?
Yes, that is the fundamental goal, I'd say, of ecolinguistics, is to find positive narratives, beneficial stories, and then to promote them and to spread them. So one way to do that is to work directly with organizations. So I work with Greenpeace and I've examined their campaigns and I've given them input into the framing of campaigns to see if they can give some kind of different messages through their campaigns. So working directly with interested people who are really wanting to spread positive stories. But there's also some people who maybe are spreading negative stories, like the intensive agriculture industries. They're spreading negative stories, and really you want to work with them to help them to change the kind of language that they use to promote beneficial stories. And you might think, well, that's completely impossible. But I really believe that nobody wants to be speaking and writing in ways that are causing death and destruction. I really believe that in the end, people are fundamentally good and that you can work with people to help them to express their deepest values in the language that they use. So I really think not just working with environmental charities, but working with some of the most damaging industries in the world, that is also really important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Erin, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I've learned so much. I hope everyone else listening has too. And thank you so much for the work that you do and taking the time to share it with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, please do. I'd be very happy to carry on the conversation with you over email. So thanks very much for inviting me. And I hope the rest of the conference is brilliant.